right, look, I'll see you guys. All right. See you later. Okay, hey man, my name is Michael. Can you hear me? Give me a thumbs up. Awesome. Well, then I'll jump right in. So the resolution that we're going to be debating today is that the 21st century is the best era in American history. I think it's pretty straightforward. I don't think we really need to define much. It generally speaks for itself. I want to define an era as a century. So we're looking at, because it says the 21st century is an era. So if we're going to look at eras, we're saying the 21st century is the best out of all the centuries that the United States has been in existence. I want to offer you a weighing mechanism that's two-pronged. The first one is going to be life in terms of quantity, and life, secondly, in terms of quality. And the reason I think this is the best way to determine if the resolution is true or not is because this is the most broad and the most foundational way to look at the resolution. The resolution says, like when we look at an era in American history, an era is usually 100 years, or at least part of 100 years, and America is pretty large. So we need to look at things that are impactful across the United States as a whole. So I think if we look at life and quality of life for the average individual, that's going to give us the best indicator of what era was the best. Looking at individual examples is going to be less relevant. This will give us the most accurate predictor of if the resolution is true or not. My arguments are going to have three arguments. They're going to mostly hinge off this argument that technology is a good thing, that has substantially improved the number of lives and the quality of life for people in the United States, specifically in the 21st century. And that's going to be seen through a couple different arguments. The first one is number of lives. Now, the good news is that since we're debating on QallOut here, we aren't really at risk of dying from pneumonia or of a common cold because we saved millions of people's lives who previously died from preventable diseases. Heart disease, cancer, tuberculosis, they're all continually going down as we develop new cures. Things like the polio vaccine, insulin, and penicillin alone were responsible for saving literally tens of millions of people. Less people are dying than ever today. The average life expectancy is nearly 80 per year. In the 19th and 20th century, it was closer to 50. So the 21st century is doing well in the terms of quantity of lives. We're saving a lot of people. But secondly, quality of life is huge. Now, the economics here are really beautiful because even the most impoverished people in the United States have a luxury that previously was inaccessible, mostly due to technology. A study done by the Heritage Foundation found that according to data compiled by other government agencies, the typical household that's considered poor has a car, air conditioning, satellite TV, 2 color televisions, a DVD, a VCR, usually an Xbox or PlayStation, a kitchen with a refrigerator, an oven, a stove, and a microwave. Even the poorest people have huge benefits afforded to them. The last argument I want to make here is civil rights. Now, today, obviously, Native Americans and persons of color are enslaved or massacred and are largely integrated in society and successfully. Women can vote, and that's what...
All right, can you hear me? I will jump right into it as well. So the first thing that I have contention with is I sternly disagree with your definition of era. I believe that if you were to define era as a century, the 21st century would a priori be eliminated from the resolution, as we are talking about the best era in American history, and not all of the 21st century has yet come to pass. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, an era is a long and distinct period of history with a particular feature or characteristic. Given as an example in this definition is the Roosevelt era, which we know from his presidency as a period of 8 years. Likewise, it is clear that, as I said, we are not talking about a century that's fully come to pass. So from this, I extract that an era can be a brief period of time, not specific to a certain length, and is generally actually roughly a decade or two when you look at how some of the other eras have been defined, such as, the Jazz era, the Roaring '20s, which I will actually be referring to quite a lot in this debate, or the Reagan era. So you can have an era that is a short period of time, and certainly if you're going to define the 21st century as one in history, which according to the resolution we must, you only have 17 years to work with. So to define an era in history as the best, I agree we need a metric. I agree that life is a good one, but I don't believe it's the only one. So the metrics that I offer are actually taken from perhaps the most famous words of the American Declaration of Independence, namely life, liberty, and happiness. I believe these are good metrics to use because they are objective moral goods and can be summed up in the overall idea of eudaimonia, which is Greek for human flourishing. These are generally cited also as examples of inalienable rights given to us by our Creator, which our very government was created to protect. So clearly these are the best metrics to use. And if I can demonstrate that the 21st century is outdone by at least one era in American history by these categories, then the 21st century is not the best. Therefore, the resolution should be negated and the vote should fall to con. With those definitional things cleared up, in my next speeches, I will make cases for each of these values being lacking in the 21st century compared to other eras, and my case for a specific era which is measurably better in these regards. For now, I will pass you back the mic.
Okay, yeah, so the only thing we disagree on here is a framework issue, which is that an era doesn't equal a century. And there's two reasons for why I think that an era should equal a century. Although I think I can still win the debate, even if the viewers believe the argument that you're making. An era is a century because the resolution says it is. It says that the 21st century is the best era, which means that it is applying the era-ness or the definition of era to a century, specifically the 21st one. The fact that the 21st century hasn't been completed yet doesn't mean that it's not an era. I can say that an era, the 19th century or the 20th century, is an era. So this is this is a contextual wording issue. I'm not necessarily. It really depends on what era you offer as the era. If it's like a 2-year period where something good happened, then maybe I'll take issue with it. But I don't think it's going to be a huge deal either way. Again, I think my case is pretty self-explanatory. I don't need to go over it again. The fact that today we're saving more lives than ever, the fact that we have better quality of life than ever, economically speaking, like you can go to McDonald's and for $5 you can get a cheeseburger, French fries, a soft drink, and an ice cream cone. And even a poor person can afford that. That's really awesome. And then finally, civil rights are a huge issue. The fact that, people who look differently aren't just killed or murdered or enslaved based on that. The fact that women can actually vote. These are all unique benefits to the 21st century. So I'll go ahead and let you make your case. Tell me what era has been superior.
All right. So, yeah, as for your definitional contention about era, once again, if you read the resolution, it does say in American history, which is definitionally events having occurred in the past. By that definition, you would be excluding the 21st century as it has not come to pass. You would only have 17 years to work with. So we aren't necessarily talking about a century here. And the era which I will offer is a period of roughly 10 years, a decade, which I feel is fair. You could say those other things are eras, but again, it would kind of eliminate the 21st century as being relevant here. So, in the category of life, you say that because there's a higher quantity and a higher quality of life, the 21st century is superior to all other eras. I actually have issue with this. Yes, there have been significant advances in technology and in civil rights. However, technology is not intrinsically good. Technology is a matter of potential. For every technological advancement, you can find me in medicine and in life-saving technology. I could find you 2 or 3 for weapons technology, for warfare, and technologies that make atrocities and violations of human rights much more possible and much more horrible. So technology in and of itself is not good. Technology in and of itself is neutral. Furthermore, civil rights. Yes, it's fantastic that we have so many civil rights in the 21st century. However, in spite of that, racial tensions are at an all-time high. In the 1920s, which again is the era which I will be citing as superior to the 21st century, the year 1920 itself saw the 19th Amendment ratified, giving the women the right to vote. So if that is one of the metrics that you want to use, then I posit that the year 1920 was a fantastic year for civil rights, and the 1920s saw significant advancements therein. Furthermore, the 1920s saw the invention of the automobile, color television, and many of the luxuries which you rightly claim that households commonly enjoy today. These were created in the 1920s, and in the 1920s, prior to the Great Depression, which started at the end therein, many households enjoyed these as a common luxury. The Ford Model T cost approximately $250 at the time that it was created. And with the economic prosperity that the United States saw in the post-war era of the 1920s, most households were able to afford this. So I will pass the mic back to you. I will cover in future speeches how some of the other things that you mentioned are not unique to the 21st century, and the 21st century actually does see a lot of detriments therein.
Okay, awesome. So basically, to be clear, and you can give me a thumbs up if this is the case, you're arguing that the 1920s is superior to the 21st century, correct? Okay. So we'll establish this very clearly then. Your burden in this debate round is to show that on the metrics that we've offered, which is quantity of lives and quality of lives, and then we can look at life, liberty, and happiness as well, because I think those are generally speaking subsets of those two ideas. If the 20s, the roaring 20s as it were, is superior to the 21st century, or at least the 17, almost 18 years that we've had so far. Now, you've made a couple different arguments on this point. The first thing, though, is you haven't really addressed the fact that of life expectancy. Specifically in the 1920s, average life expectancy was about 50 years for people, which means that you died at 50, which means you lost 30 years of average living. That's problematic. Additionally, disease killed people, tons of people. In fact, you were lucky if you had a majority of the children that you gave birth to live past the age of 6, because the majority of them did not live. So on this notion of lives, I think the 20s is very clearly losing, just because average life expectancy is a lot lower, diseases were a lot worse. We didn't have a polio vaccine, insulin, penicillin, those things that like save tens of millions of people's lives. So the 21st century is clearly winning in that regard. The second argument you make is in response to about technology. I totally agree with you. Technology is morally neutral. I'm not saying technology is inherently beneficial. What I am saying is that technology has provided unique benefits and impacts that have made the 21st century, through that potential that you talk about, the best one. The fact that we have iPhones and laptops, the fact that we have QallOut and are able to do this debate, yet we're presumably hundreds of miles away. I guess I don't know where you live. But hypothetically, you could be in Australia and you could be doing this debate with me. The fact that we have the ability to cure cancer in a lot of different areas, the fact that we can cure heart disease, the fact that we can drive cars. These are all things that are huge benefits technology has provided us, specifically in the 20th century. So I think I'm still winning on the tech argument here. You're going to have a real difficult time proving that the 1920s had a significant technological advantage to the 21st century. The last argument you make is you say, well, racial tensions today are at an all-time high. Oh, and yeah, women finally got the right to vote in 1920, so I guess that's great. Couple things. First of all, racial tension is clearly bad, but it's a whole lot better than black people being forced to ride on the back of the bus and having to use their own restrooms, which, by the way, was the 1920s, the segregation era. So if you're going to somehow argue that it's better for black people to be segregated where we have no racial tension whatsoever, it's just better if they just stay separated and they get the inferior alternatives. I think that's a pretty awful argument. Additionally, I don't think you're going to be able to prove that women's rights haven't gotten better since their right to vote. So I don't think you're winning any of these arguments. I pass it back, though.
Okay, so my opponent says that I'm not winning any of these arguments. And to be honest, so far I've been playing defense against why his arguments are not unique to the 21st century. So in this talk, I will go into why I feel that I do have good arguments for the 21st century actually being quite deficit in these areas and the 1920s actually being superior in some of them. So he says that my burdens include demonstrating the 1920s to be better than the 21st century. Technically, no. I could demonstrate that any era is better than the 21st century, and the resolution would be negated. I have chosen the 1920s so that we have a point of reference, but moreover, I'm going to be demonstrating that the 21st century is one of the worst, therefore not the best. So on the metric of life, you claim that life expectancy has severely increased, and that's true. While it is true, cancer rates, heart disease, obesity, and quality of life have actually decreased in a lot of areas. So 16 million Americans suffer from a major depressive episode in the past year, according to a 2015 study. In spite of what we think the advancements in technology and civil rights and women's rights, as you claim, have brought, data consistently shows that Americans of the 21st century are miserable compared to nearly all previous decades. According to a study in 2009, the overall happiness of women has been in steady decline since the 1970s and is still in a downward trend. Suicide rates are at a record high with 13.4 per 100,000. I tried to find in the 1920s, but they were so low that they were completely unreportable. 23.5 million Americans today are addicted to alcohol and drugs. This is approximately 1 in 10 Americans over the age of 12. This is not only an affront to happiness and life, but liberty as well, since an addict is a slave to their own impulses. Half of Americans will contract an STD by the age of 25. There are quite a lot of metrics which show that the 21st century, for all the advancements it's made, has actually made quite a few steps backwards. Let's see. You claim that the technological advancements in this century, while being morally neutral, have opened up quite a lot of opportunities, and I posit that the 1920s is at least a parallel era in that the technological advancement made back then was significant in the same sense that it is now. You do claim that you never said technology was intrinsically good. That's not true. You actually did say that technology was intrinsically good. You backpedaled on that, but that's all right. And I will pass the mic back to you.
Okay, so there's a couple different arguments here. The first thing we need to address, though, is the fact that this burden is a comparative one. Or the resolution, excuse me, is a comparative one. Meaning the debate today is not, are people in the 21st century, are their lives perfect or imperfect? Are there problems with America in the 21st century, or are there not problems? The question specifically is 21st century, on balance, the best one? Now, I want to go ahead and look at you dropped all of the arguments that I made in the last speech about technology, about women's rights, about how lives are still like incredibly are much better and much longer here. You really haven't addressed my particular case. But I'll go ahead and look at the arguments that you made in your last speech. Your first argument that you make is on this notion of depression. You basically say, well, Americans aren't happy. First of all, studies that say people aren't happy are incredibly subjective and immeasurable, in the sense that one person's lack of happiness can be totally different from another person's. Specifically on the issue of depression and mental illness was a thing that was totally not understood prior to the 1990s, and our understanding of it is still being it's still being developed. So the fact that you can say, oh, well, look, we have all this depression today, that didn't necessarily mean we didn't have that back then. We couldn't measure it in the 20s, so there's not going to be any statistics that say, oh yeah, well, all these people took med depressants, so therefore they are a lot more unhappy than they were back then. The second thing here, you talk about alcoholism. Alcoholism certainly can't be much worse today than it was back then. Also, alcohol was illegal in the 1920s, so there's also that. Remember, your criteria is that we should have liberty. If you're going to say that we should have liberty, I don't see how banning alcohol falls into the criteria you've offered here. Basically, your argument here is, well, Americans have problems. Oh, the last thing you make is heart disease and a couple other diseases. Oh, how they're not that great right now. Lots of people are dying from obesity. Over the last 20 years, specifically from 1990 to 2017, heart disease and obesity rates have dropped 67 and 73% respectively. And they're certainly a lot better than your kids dying at age 5, half of your children dying at age 5 because, polio or pneumonia or a common cold. So this notion that like, oh yeah, Americans eat cheeseburgers, that's so bad. Let's go, Americans take depressants. That's really bad. Let's go to the 1920s where we segregate black people and children die before they reach age 3 and you don't ever live longer than 50. Like the alternative here is absolutely ridiculous. You can talk about how there's problems in the 21st century. I'll absolutely concede that there are problems, but it's not even an argument that you can make that you would prefer the 1920s over the 21st century. The question here is this: if you had the opportunity to go back to the 1920s and live there live 10 years there instead of here, would you do it? Answer that question.
I actually would, yes. So the fact that you give for the segregation of African-American citizens, that is terrible. However, since we were talking about the overall happiness of American citizens, and black people made up a significantly lower percentage of the population back then, that is not necessarily a statistic which can come into play to say that overall the happiness of Americans was lower. I'm not downplaying the horrors of segregation, but actually, if you look at the 21st century, we're seeing segregation begin to emerge again. We have campuses calling for areas where white people are not allowed. We have the same racial tensions that were back in the 1920s are actually erupting once again today. So just like you can say that my arguments of the 21st century having problems don't hold water for it not being the best era, well, likewise, you can say that the 1920s had problems as well, but that doesn't necessarily mean it is not the best era. So again, on the metric of life, we have a couple of things in the 21st century which demonstrate that the 21st century American does not value life the way that the American citizen did in previous centuries. The first is low birth rates. The birth rate in the United States has hit a record low in 2016 at 62 births per 1,000 women aged 15 to 44. This was down 1% from 2015, which was the previous record low, and it's following a trend that's still declining. So while you say that the quantity of life is increasing and the quality of life might be increasing, Americans today do not have the same respect for life. And I feel that this is a metric which plays into the life category very well. The second is abortion. Now, I'm aware that not everyone believes life begins at conception, but I believe there is an objective case for the problem of abortion indicating a devaluation of life. According to recent surveys, 50% of Americans are pro-life, while only 41% are pro-choice. So objectively, to more Americans than not, the problem of abortion is a direct affront to life and can be considered murder. So just since the beginning of the 21st century, more than 14 million abortions have taken place. This is the Holocaust twice. So if you are of the stance that abortion is an affront to life, which the majority of Americans today are, and the majority of Americans throughout history have been, then this is a serious problem to the 21st century American valuing life. And I don't necessarily need to demonstrate. Oh, I have to pass the mic.
Okay, so before I take a look at the arguments you've last addressed, I just want to hit the abortion argument and the argument that says we shouldn't consider the black people that were segregated because they made up a minority of the population. You made the argument that there were 14 million abortions that happened. And then you also made the argument that blacks, since they were a minority, it doesn't really play into the resolution because they're an average. There were 34 million black people that were segregated. So my question is, are the abortions in the minority as well as the black people, or do both of them matter, or does one of them matter more or less?
Okay, so there is a difference between poor living conditions and outright murder. If I did say, I didn't mean to say that the black people don't play into the resolution. I meant to say that when speaking about the quantifier that you gave about the overall life for the average American citizen, since they were a lower percentage of the population back then, it was not as weighty. So that's to answer that question.
Well, if your argument is, if you're going to make an argument that abortion is impactful to the resolution, then I'm going to be equally allowed to make the argument that segregation and slavery is also impactful to the resolution. In fact, I'll argue that it's more impactful since more black people were affected by slavery, affected by abortion. So the argument here, you're not actually winning. There's a couple different arguments I want to make in response to abortion as well. The first one is that abortion still existed in the 1920s. It existed in all centuries. I don't like abortion, actually. I actually agree with you that life begins at conception, and I'll totally concede to you that like the United States has a problem on its hands when they say that that we are killing people with abortion, and I'll totally concede that to you. The reality is, though, that this is non-unique to the 21st century. It happened in the 20s just as much as it happened in the 21st century. Additionally, today, because of the medical breakthroughs that we have, childbirth in general is safer for mothers, which means that, like, sure, abortion may kill 14 million people, and that's really, really bad. But in the 1920s, you were lucky if half of your children made it past age 5. So clearly, clearly abortion is wrong, and I'll agree with you on that point. But it's not unique to the 21st century, and I'll outweigh you on the fact that people didn't make it. Children didn't make it past age 5 in most regards. And you're also still being inconsistent on this notion of, well, it's only a minority instance, so it can't be considered in the resolution. If we can't look at how black people were segregated, then you can't look at how abortion was actually impactful. Now let's take a look at the other argument. But the first thing I want to make is, in every speech you've come up with several new arguments, and I've offered responses to all of them. And then you come up in the next speech and you ignore the responses and you bring up new arguments. Now this is fine. And I'm not criticizing your style. What I am saying, though, is that you're leaving arguments on the table that I've responded to and not offering responses to them. So all the arguments you make in the beginning about technology being inherently amoral, about women's rights, about how there's racial tensions today, about how Americans are miserable, about how alcoholism is a problem, these are all arguments that I responded to that you haven't responded back to as well. The other two arguments you make here is you talk about low birth rates. Sure, I'll concede that the number of women that are giving birth is lower. I don't see that as inherently problematic. There's no impact to this argument whatsoever. We're still growing. In fact, we're growing faster than like we've ever grown in the last decade, at least. Maybe today we have a lower birth rate than we had 10 years ago. But look up birth rates compared to the 20s to 2017 or the 21st century. I'm not sure what the differences would be. That's what you have to show, though. Additionally, if your birth rate is incredibly high, but all your children die, that's not really such a great thing after all. You really haven't addressed my case, either of my contentions about quality of life and number of lives either, so those go conceded as well.
So my opponent claims that I have not addressed his responses and his claims about quality of life in the 21st century. And it's true. That's the reason that I haven't addressed them directly, is because I don't intend to refute them. There is significant advancement in the 21st century regarding quality of life, and for the most part, the things that he said, I concede them. However, you will notice that my opponent conceded a critical point to me. According to his own argumentation, the problem of abortion is an affront to life, and an abortion represents murder. So how can one say that in the 21st century, when we have had 14 million lives murdered from the turn of the century until now, that this century is more conducive to quantity and quality of life? It makes no sense whatsoever. My opponent says that abortion is not unique to the 21st century and that the numbers were just as high in the 20s. I wholeheartedly disagree. I actually looked up the number for this, and in the year 1926, a total of 2 abortions were reported. 2. Yes, it is true that abortion was illegal back then, so abortions which did take place were severely underreported, but I find it hard to believe that my opponent would claim just as many abortions took place back then. Even after the onset of Roe versus Wade, where abortion became legal and the statistics were reported, we've seen a massive boom in abortion statistics since the turn of the century, even after they were legal and even after they were all reported. The average number of abortions per year is approximately 700,000. This is unprecedented in the 21st century. And I will make this the pressing issue of the debate, because my opponent claims that quantity and quality of life are better in the 21st century than any other century or than any other era in American history. And yet he concedes that abortion statistics in this era represent 14 million innocent lives. I simply do not see how this is defensible to my opponent's view, and I will pass the mic back to him to allow him to retort.
Okay, so I'll ask you this. Are you winning any other arguments besides the abortion one?
Currently, you have me on most of them. I will give you that. The 21st century is a great era, and I admit that it is it's flourishing in a lot of ways, but it does have its problems. And a lot of the parallels of advancement in this era now can be drawn to the 1920s. It was a time of economic prosperity. It was a post-war era. People were celebrating. And the one point which I will drive home once again is that in the 21st century, unprecedented to any other era in American history, you have an affront to life, which you yourself have conceded. So I don't need to demonstrate that the 21st century is not necessarily the best era in American history if I can demonstrate that it is arguably the worst.
Okay, so there's 2 metrics that we're using to weigh the resolution: quality of life and quantity of life. Now, my opponent has already admitted that he's not winning any arguments except for the abortion one. And since abortion doesn't affect quality of life, it only affects quantity of lives, I'm automatically winning the quality debate. He's conceded my second contention about how about economics. He's conceded the fact that 34 million Black people were segregated and mistreated, and my contention about technology and economics was dropped, as well as average life expectancy. So there's no question that the 21st century is the best for quality of life. The question then becomes, what about quantity of life? 14 million people died to abortion. There were hundreds of million people dying to preventable diseases like pneumonia, like polio, like the common cold. He concedes my evidence that show that the technological and medical advances today saved hundreds of millions of people that died. Look, literally, if you had 5 kids, 3 of them were likely to die. There's no way that he's winning on the numbers debate here. The quantity and the quality are both on my side.
My opponent contends that in American history, we're currently saving hundreds of millions of lives from preventable diseases, and hundreds of millions were dying in the 1920s. I would like to remind you that the U.S. population was 115 million back then and is 300 million